Likutei Sichos, Chelik Chav, Volume 20, the first Sicha for Parshas Mikeitz. This Sicha is based on what Rashi says, what he explains, on Pasuk Nun in Perek Mem Aleph, that's verse 50 in chapter 41 in our Parsha. This isn't, quote-unquote, a typical Rashi Sicha. Rather, the Sicha will explain very creatively and beautifully and back up what Rashi explains and his conclusion on the words in this pasuk. Just as a quick introduction, some of the rules in Rashi which we're well familiar with. First of all, Rashi wrote his pirush in such a manner that even a quote, Ben Chamesh Shana Lemikra, can easily understand it. In other words, it's with full and absolute clarity. Number two, every word in Rashi, every expression is precise and exact and brings out a point. And a third thing is that sometimes Rashi will explain something according to Pshutei Shel Mikra, even though it's not necessarily consistent with the way the Medrash explains it, the way the Gemara explains it, or other sources. Something to familiarize ourselves with, the concept, the idea of Midas Chasidus. Midas Chasidus means that there are certain things that are not obligatory. In other words, halacha does not mandate that you must do it. However, anybody that's a frum Jew or beyond or above that, meaning somebody who behaves in a manner of midas chasidus, certainly would adhere to it. Another thing to familiarize ourselves with, the idea of chazaka. Chazaka means that according to halacha, when something happens several times, or it happens over a certain period of time, it becomes like an established pattern, and that makes it as if it's an established fact. Let's go into the Sicha. On the Pasuk, like I said, chapter 41, verse 50, it says, that to Yosef was born two sons before the year of the famine came. So Rashi says, quote, Mikan, from here meaning from this we learn, from here, this is our source, she'asur la'odom l'shamish mitase b'shnei ra'avin, that a person is forbidden to engage in marital relations in the years of famine, in years of hunger. Says the Tosfos asks on this, and the Tosfos says, 1 second, we know, not too long after this, that Yocheved, the daughter of Levi, she was born, quote, bein hachomis, between the walls, as they entered Egypt. Now, certainly, if she was born as they entered Egypt, that means she was conceived during the years of the famine. Because when did the brothers come? When did Yaakov and his sons arrive to Mitzrayim? They arrived towards the end of the second year of the famine. So, if that's the case, and her mother was pregnant with her, and she was in the 9th month, and she gave birth right there as they entered Mitzrayim. So how could you possibly suggest, says Tosfos, according to Rashi at least, it would be suggested that Levi transgressed, that Levi did something that's forbidden? That's very hard to accept. Likewise, other Mefarshim ask the following. We know that Yitzchak Avinu, if you remember way back when he left Eretz Yisrael proper and he went to Plishtim, to Avimelech. Why did he go? Because there was a famine. And there a whole story back and forth, and then eventually Avimelech, it says, quote, he saw that he saw that Yitzchak was behaving with Rivka as a husband behaves with a wife. And literally the way the Chachamim explained it is that he saw suggestively that Yitzchak was mishamish mitasei, that Yitzchak was engaging in marital relations. Again, once again, the question is, it was a year of famine. Clearly, as the Torah spells out, how is it possible, based on what Rashi just explained, that Yitzchak should do such a thing? Now, the Mefarshim, they try to explain this away with various answers. For example, number one, that it's not an actual prohibition, it's only midas chasidus, as I explained in the introduction. Another suggestion is that if it was before Matan Torah, it wasn't really forbidden. It was just that Yosef accepted it on himself, so to speak, voluntarily, and that this is just an asmachta. We just rely on this as a source as a very, very light source in the Torah, but it's not really something that was prohibited prior to Matan Torah. Others suggest that, wait, it depends. If one didn't have children yet, and one did not fulfill his obligation of pruvu, then this doesn't apply to them, this prohibition. In other words, they're allowed to engage in marriage relations. Others even suggest that if it's the night of mikvah, then you're allowed to engage in marriage relations. Another answer that's given is that there's a difference of where the famine or to whom the famine is taking place. If the famine is happening li Yisrael, that means that when Jewish people, Bnei Yisrael, are shruyim betzar, are going through a difficult time, then it's forbidden. However, Yitzchak didn't have that prohibition. He was the only Jew alive, right? And it's everybody else, perhaps, in the region that was suffering. But no Jews were suffering. Likewise with Levi. Levi, as far as he knew, all Jews were not suffering because he and his brothers and his father, meaning the entire family of Yaakov, they had a plentiful amount of food. It's just when they went to buy food was just not to show off, as Yaakov told him. So he had no reason to be concerned. Now, Yosef, on the other hand, this is what the Mefarish explains, did have reason to be concerned because he had no way of knowing that Yaakov and his sons are in possession of all that wheat and all the food that they had available to them. And therefore, as far as he was concerned, perhaps they were in a tsar, perhaps they were in a difficult situation, and therefore he was under obligation. However, if any of these explanations should be correct, then we have some serious problem. Rise and Rashi address it in any way. He doesn't even hint it in any way. In no way does he suggest anything along these lines. Now, we can't say that Rashi relies on the fact. In other words, he doesn't ask the question about Levi. He doesn't ask the question about Yitzchak. He doesn't ask anything. And we can't suggest that, Rashi is relying on us, that maybe we would understand on our own any of those given answers. Says the Rebbe, that's impossible. Number one, we know that there are various questions, a plethora of questions on all those answers. And number two, the fact that Rashi doesn't give any hint whatsoever suggests that Rashi discounts it at all, the question and the answer. And moreover, and here's point number 3, we know that Rashi wrote his Pirush for a Ben Chamisham L'Mikra, that even the quote, the beginner child, the Ben Chamisham L'Mikra, the Mishnah says that a child at 5 years old begins to study Torah, even he should be able to easily and clearly understand everything. So if it wasn't so obvious, why didn't Rashi address it? And therefore we have to conclude, we have to draw the conclusion from Rashi that, number one, this is an actual prohibition according to Pshutei Shemikra. According to the way Rashi sees it, this was an actual prohibition. And that's why Rashi uses the term Mikan She'asur, that it's forbidden. That's number one. Number two, that the Isur, the prohibition, is across the board. Even to people who already have children or don't have children, regardless of their individual status of childbearing, they are under this obligation according to Rashi. And number three, that you can also draw the conclusion that this doesn't have any particular connection to Jews in general, but the fact not to who's suffering, but the fact that it's a time of suffering. Rashi uses the term shnei re'avin, years of famine, meaning that it's a time, it's an era of tsar, it's an era of re'avin, of famine, an era that the world is in a challenging time, as we'll soon understand. However, before we do so, the Rebbe asks another question, something somewhat problematic that we can ask in Rashi. Rashi says, Mikan, from here we can learn. That means this is the source. This is the primary, or perhaps the exclusive source for this idea, for this concept, for this prohibition. In other words, Rashi is negating any other sources. And in fact, there is another source, perhaps. And that is, the Gemara says, if you recall the story with Noach, when Noach entered the Teva, Hashem clearly instructs that the men enter alone and the women enter alone. And over there, Rashi himself addresses it. And Rashi says that because the world was sharui bitzar, because the world was in a time of calamity, a time of challenge, therefore it was forbidden during that entire year of the Mabul, it was forbidden to engage in marital relationships, marital relations. And therefore, Rashi obviously is negating that and says, no, I disagree with the Gemara over here, at least according to Pshutei Shemikra, that is not the source for what we're talking about here, the reason why it's prohibited to engage in marital relations during a time of famine. But the question is, why? Why is it? Why is Rashi so adamant that this is the only source and not anywhere else? Why not? Why not learn it from the story of Noach? Says the Rebbe, the answer is as follows. Rashi could not learn it from the story of Noach because over there, the way Rashi describes it there, if you look into Rashi, ha'olam sharui b'tzar, the world was engaged in a calamity, in a difficult situation, meaning the world in general, not even particularly any of the creatures, because remember, there were almost no creatures left. No humans, no animals, nothing. Everything was wiped out. It's the world itself, the world in its generality, that was in a tsar, in a time, in a difficult situation. And therefore from there you cannot bring proof to a time when there's famine. Because during a time of famine, it's not, quote, the whole world, the oilam das shara b'tzar, because you always have a situation where maybe the mass and the majority of the masses, the majority of, and the multitude of the multitudes have an issue that they are lacking their nutrition, that they are lacking food. There is a ra'avain, there is a famine. However, you always have a certain segment of the population that does have access to food, whether it's because they're rich or they're not suffering as much from the famine. So this would not serve as a proper source. This, meaning the story of Noach, as a proper source when the entire world, including Noach and everyone that was in the Teva, was under the same tsar equally. And therefore Rashi learns it specifically, he derives it specifically from our story, the story of Yosef. Now we'll take a closer look at the expressions of Rashi and we'll better understand, we'll have a better appreciation why this is the better source. We understood why that's not a good source, but why is this such a good source? What is so good about this source? So and we'll appreciate why he learns it from here and not from Yitzchak. You see, Rashi writes the words, B'terem tavoi shnei harav. I'm sorry, that Mikansha also la'adam mishamish dasa b'shnei harav, in years of famine. Notice, in the pasuk, what does it say? That Yosef had his children, B'terem tavoi shnas harav, the year of, singular. Rashi, however, emphasizes plural, shnei harav. There's a big difference here, not just in quantity, but so to speak in quality, in the essence of the matter. You see, when there is only a famine, when there's a famine only 1 year, that perhaps can be dismissed to a certain extent. That's like, no, okay, this is an incident, or perhaps even somewhat of a coincidence because of certain factors, that perhaps this year was not a very good year. It was not a blessed year. And therefore, that is not cause, that is not reason to create a situation in which across the board, people should now stop to engage in normal activity. People should start to, so to speak, mourn even in their private life. However, when there is shnei ra'av, years, plural, of famine, this is already no longer a coincidence. This is no longer just an isolated incident. This already is evidence of the fact that something prolonged is happening and it's coming from Hashem. There's something going on over here. And this is the reason why when there are shnei ra'av, when there are years of famine, in other words, it becomes like a pattern, it becomes like a chazaka, it becomes an established fact that there's something terrible going on here. That becomes cause, that becomes reason that even those that are not suffering directly from the Rav, someone like Yosef, who certainly was not suffering from the famine, he had an abundance and he had full access to it, but even someone like him has to now refrain from marital relations. Why? Because this shows that there's something wrong going on in the world. Something up there that is directing the world now, not in the direction of, quote, Yeshuvah Shel Olam, the normal order of the world's existence, but rather in an opposite direction, which tells us that therefore you're not allowed to engage in marital relations, which promotes the normal order of world's existence. And therefore you have to refrain. Now, since the whole premise, as we just explained, is that the prohibition of engaging in marriage relations is when you have shnei ra'av, when you have an established chazaka, almost like an established fact, a pattern, that this is what's going on, and therefore that makes it strong enough, a reason, a cause, to negate the mitzvah of pruvu. Remember, the mitzvah of pruvu is the first mitzvah to mankind. That makes it strong enough. In other words, when you have an established chazaka, that's when you have not only the right, but the obligation to override the mitzvah. That tells us that anything less than that, meaning anything less than this established chazaka, that it's a pattern, it's a situation of ra'av, then you're not allowed to, you're forbidden to override this mitzvah. You're forbidden to negate this mitzvah of pruvu. Especially because it's only a suffering of only a few. And therefore now we'll understand. By Yitzchak, it was only 1 year. By Yitzchak, it was only 1 year. So this wasn't enough cause for him to negate such a great mitzvah. Now by Levi, even though it was more than a year, but it was only in the beginning of the second year. So he didn't know yet that it's going to continue into a full second year and therefore become established as somewhat as a chazaka, as a fact. However, Yosef did know. Yosef already knew in advance, and he knew this clearly, with certainty, that there are going to be, quote, years, plural, of famine. And therefore, for him, it was forbidden. And that's why from here is the source. This is the primary source, according to Rashi, that when there are years of famine, you're not allowed to engage in marriage relations. Now, of course, you can still ask the question, wait, why are we saying that Levi didn't know that this was an established problem, that there was a chazaka here of famine? Didn't Levi also hear, as well as his brothers and everyone, about this amazing prodigy, about this young slave turned king who gave this interpretation of a dream? Why wasn't that enough for him to know, just like Yosef knew, that the famine is going to last, it's going to be prolonged for many years, and therefore he should have already in advance not engaged in marriage relations, and then Yocheved wouldn't have been born? The answer is, it's very obvious. Levi could not rely on some hearsay of some prodigy, of some youth, of some slave that stood up, became a king, he gave interpretation. He doesn't know. Maybe this is true, maybe this is not true. How do we know? In other words, there's no established fact to go with. There's no certainty to be able to count on, to use that as enough power to override a mitzvah, which is an established mitzvah to mankind, which Hashem says, pruvu. However, Yosef himself did know. Okay, he did know what it is. Okay? Now, by the way, also considering something which Rashi himself says in relations to Yosef's dreams, that ein chaloim b'lo dvarim b'telim. There are never dreams without any empty and unfulfilled details in the dream. In other words, it's possible that even though they saw that the world's experienced the 7 years of abundance, but they still would not have had the certainty that the years of famine are coming. But Yosef did know. According to this explanation, we could also now appreciate and understand even more the emphasis of the pasuk. Notice that the pasuk does not say that Yosef conceived his children before the years of famine came, but rather it says that the children were born to Yosef before the famine came. That means Yosef planned it out in such a manner, not only that they were conceived before, that they were already born, they already were alive before the years of famine kicked in. Why? Because since Yosef knew clearly and absolutely, with certainty, that there are going to be years of famine, so he did whatever is in his power. He did everything possible. He orchestrated everything in such a manner that not only the conception should be before the famine, but also the birth. Why? Because in a time, as we said before, in a time when there's famine, for a prolonged time, which is an indicator of the fact that Hashem is disrupting the normal order of the establishment of the world, the Yeshuvah Shel Olam, then it's not a time that you should, so to speak, interfere with that and, so to speak, bring new life, which is the greatest symbol of Yeshiva Shalom. So since Yosef, typically no one has any advanced knowledge, but in this case Yosef was privy to that, and he had clear and advanced knowledge of exactly what's going to be, he did everything possible that also the birth should be in advance.